if your licks are starting to sound a little boring, take this one simple little trick and add it to any of your licks to make that lick go from kind of boring to amazing. So this concept is sometimes called enclosure. And what it means is that we're going to take a target note, but instead of going straight to the target note, we're going to go above the target note, below the target note, and then we're going to hit the target note right on. And this works especially well when the target note is a major third of a chord. Now, if you've seen my previous video called Target Notes the Easy Way, you'll know how to find these target notes really easily without having to memorize that the major third of an A chord is C sharp, because that's hard for a lot of people to memorize for every single chord. And then you'd also have to know exactly where all your C sharps are on the fretboard, which is a lot of work. The easier way, just very briefly, is we can imagine the chord shape underneath. And then we just have to memorize which one of these notes is the important target note, in this case, the major third. And in this case, it's the note that my second finger is on here. That is a C sharp, right? But we don't necessarily need to know it's a C sharp. We just know it's the major third. So if that's my target note when I'm playing minor pentatonic over this major chord, I can go above the target note, below the target note, and on the target note. And now, instead of just descending A minor pentatonic or noodling all over A minor pentatonic, now not only do I have a target note, I have a very interesting way of approaching the target note, making it sound very kind of funky, very bluesy, almost jazzy, because we have all this dissonance that eventually resolves on the target note. So this one, you may have played before because this is actually a very common blues lick. But we're going to do them in different parts of the fretboard and on different chords in this video. But first, let's just make sure you all know where this one is, right? As we said, it's in this A major chord and we can visualize it there. It's not in A minor pentatonic, right? Because A minor pentatonic doesn't have that note. But remember, what we're doing often in blues and in classic rock and sometimes in country is that even though we're soloing over a major chord, often we're using minor pentatonic. The two don't really make sense harmonically, but it just sounds great. It's the sound of the blues. It's the sound of a lot of rock and roll, right? So let's say we're just descending A minor pentatonic. And we're visualizing, we're thinking ahead. When we have target notes, we just have to think ahead. We got to know, okay, the song's on an A major chord right now. A really good target note is the major third of that chord, especially when I'm playing A minor pentatonic, because we haven't heard that note yet, right? I'm going to visualize the major third, but instead of playing the major third, I'm going to go above it, below it, and then hit it. So that's a very simple example. More interesting than just going to the root on A minor pentatonic. That just sounds like the scale, right? That's sometimes why a lot of our licks sound boring after a while, is because they're too scale-wise. Not only does this target note break up the scale-wise sense of this lick, but it's dissonance and resolve to the target note makes it sound especially cool. And you can do this at the beginning of any lick, in the middle of any lick, or use it as the ending of any lick to turn those tired old licks into something really amazing. So let's do another example. Let's take the lick from my video called Stop Playing This Lick, this overused lick, right? And I'll end it with the enclosure. That's actually pretty cool now because we have a classic blues lick with the blue note, but then doing the enclosure above, below, hit it. Or I could add the root to the end of that. It gives it a little more, I don't know, emphasis on that root, more resolve. Right? And so we know where that major third is because that major third is there in that chord. But there are major thirds elsewhere on the fretboard, right? And we can find these major thirds also by visualizing, yes, chord shapes, but sometimes also just common interval shapes. And this one is a very common interval shape. We can see A to C sharp there like that. So that might not be in our common chord shapes here in this area, but it's in a lot of common chord shapes. If you think of like a cowboy G chord, it's there. Or a cowboy C chord, it's there. So you can just memorize that whenever you have a root on the lower, on almost any string, right? Except for that B string changes things. But whenever you have a root on those other strings, you have this major third. And we can target that. So if we target just the major third, let's descend the scale. Blue note. And I do my enclosure around it, right? So it might be... That's great, because I have the blue note above it too, right? It has a really interesting sound, right? You kind of do have to hear it against the chord with a jam track to really hear. Otherwise, sometimes when I teach this to some of my students, they're like, oh, that sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? And then we play it against the jam track with a major chord underneath, and they go, oh, I see. Yeah, it really just fits in that chord. And the major thirds are so bright and interesting sounding, right? They're more interesting than the roots. They really jump out, especially when you hear it against the chord. So now we have two places for that major third in this area. We have the enclosure there and the enclosure here. So we could do a longer lick that combines them both. I'll start at the top of the A minor pentatonic shape. That's a pretty sweet lick. I got blue notes in there, I've got A minor pentatonic, I've got target notes of a major third, and I've got enclosure around those target notes. It's actually a very complex lick. But when you visualize it, it's not that hard. Just like you visualize A minor pentatonic, you can visualize where those major thirds are, and then you can visualize enclosing those major thirds. And we can play longer lines. And you can go all the way to the root there if you want, right? So let's do one more major third that's commonly used that's right in this area. If we think of A minor pentatonic having an extension to the next box up, what I call the extension shape, a lot of people call this the box, whatever, it's this 5-note little piece here. This one is harder to visualize for sure because it's not going to fit in a common chord shape that you might know right away, but the major third is right there in the top of this box right here. That's the third right there. So how do I memorize where that third is? I mean, you can just memorize that it's there when you're playing in that pentatonic shape. Or it actually, if you analyze it, it still fits within our concept of memorizing this as a major third shape. This is a major third shape. This is a major third shape. This is the same, A, C sharp. Now, it does help to know that that note is an A. And most of my students don't know instantly that that's an A and therefore that's a C sharp. So that's why sometimes we want to have some other method of memorizing where these significant target notes are. Or you can just memorize that it's there at the top of this box. There they are, 3 in a row. That's a pretty nice little lick in 3 different places. We can combine them. And all I'm doing again is we have to think ahead. You can practice the licks, you can practice the tabs that I've provided here and just kind of get your fingers used to playing the specific licks. But ultimately, you want to be able to visualize where these thirds are so that you can throw them into your own licks. Okay, now, we want to be able to do the same thing as the chords of the song change, right? So most common chord change, as we know, is 1 chord to 4 chord. In this case, A chord to D chord. So now we need to know, well, where's the enclosure for the major third of the D chord? Well, we got to know where's the major third of the D chord. And like in my Target Notes the Easy Way video, we can memorize which one of these notes in this chord is the major third. It's this one. Okay, that's the F sharp of a D chord. Again, you don't need to memorize that the third is an F sharp, but you can just memorize which note it is in the chord. That's really useful to know because then you don't have to memorize that F sharp is the third of D and G sharp is the third of E and C sharp is the third of A. Oh my God. And to use that information in the middle of a solo, I mean, we can do it. I do it sometimes. I use that information sometimes, but sometimes I'm not. Sometimes I'm just using chord shapes or interval shapes and visualizing those to target what I want. So we were on the A chord playing something like, and now we're on the D chord and we could still think A minor pentatonic, but target this note. To enclose this note, right, we go above it, below it, hit it. So it might still be A minor pentatonic. That really jumps out, right? It can sound a bit weird again until you hear the chord underneath, right? Because the first few notes are very A minor pentatonic. That's a bit jazzy, it's a bit funky, but on that D chord, oof, it's gonna sound so good. And so, of course, you do have to get good at listening to the chords underneath when you're playing. You gotta know what those chords are because this lick is gonna sound good on D. It's not gonna sound that great on A. Sometimes you fluke out, but probably not. We don't wanna fluke out. We wanna know, we wanna think ahead, and we wanna know at least approximately what it's gonna sound like before we get there. We don't want those kinds of surprises, right? So let's combine an A enclosure or two to a D enclosure or two. Let's start from A, way up here. How about? That's cool. Now D. Now A. Now D. A. So just as A has a couple different places to play that major third, 3 in this area, D has 2 really nice places to play it. We've already done, now we have, and how do we know that? It's the same interval shape as we'd used for A down here, right? We had that because this is an A major interval, right? We have the same here because my D root is there, the 5th fret of the A string, so therefore its major third is always right there. So if the lower enclosure for A is, then the lower enclosure for D is, and we could be descending A minor pentatonic, but land it with the enclosure for D if the chord is changing from, say, A to D. You can really hear that note, that F sharp, is gonna jump out, right? But it's gonna sound good when that D chord comes. So the enclosure for the D chord came from this chord shape because the major third of it is there, and from this interval shape because the major third is there. Then the 5 chord is gonna look the same, right? Because the 5 chord is always 2 frets up from the 4 chord. So there's my 5 chord, it's E in this case. And so the enclosure is there, or because this is the chord shape, and that's the major third. It's G sharp in this case, but it doesn't matter. You know where it is if you memorize where it is. So we could do something really cool. We could do enclosure on the 5, enclosure on the 4, enclosure on the 1. We can hear the 5 chord, the 4 chord, the 1 chord. With 2 different enclosures in there, I think. Right? So let's do 5 chord, 4 chord, 1 chord. With 3 enclosures at the end there, right? So if you haven't already seen that other video called Target Notes the Easy Way, I'm going to put a link to it right here on the screen. It's going to show you how to find those target notes like the 3rd, but also the 5th and the root. And thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. This channel's really taken off, and we're going to do a video every Saturday for as long as I can make it. We'll see you next week.